Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I've researched many Civil War veterans over the last 25 years, and I've found, sadly, all too often that what is said of a man in death is a sign of how much love and respect they commanded in life. Such is the case with Albert Voorhees Wyckoff, who served in the 15th New York Infantry, enlisting as a corporal in 1862 and in late 1863, advancing to sergeant major, a key non-commissioned officer's position in the regiment. He's pictured here at that rank, probably not long after he earned his stripes. I want to share two anecdotes, both of which appeared in the regimental history, and each offers a small window into the heart and soul of a young man who paid for freedom with his life. In a charge at the Battle of Cold Harbor, Virginia, on June 1st, 1864, those of you who are students of the Civil War know the horrendous charges, the regret by Lieutenant General Grant, and just the sheer volume of casualties, blood, and treasure that was shed in those early days of the larger overland campaign that ended at the Battle of Petersburg, followed by the siege of Petersburg and Richmond and the end of the war. Wyckoff would never live to see any of the war's end. And now I want to share these two passages with you. The first is by Chaplain Haynes, who talks about that night on June 1st, 1864, after the charges, after many of his comrades lay on the battlefield yet to be found and attended to. So here's Chaplain Haynes's anecdote, which references several soldiers and, of course, Wyckoff. So here we go. Quote, "When night settled down over the bloody field, I started with several attendants to find the regiment, which we did at last after some risk. On our way, we found the bodies of several men from our regiment, which we could recognize by their accoutrements differing from the rest of the army. One of these was Henry J. Incho, Company H, a young soldier in his 20th year. His head was blown entirely off, and we only learned who he was from a locket and a letter taken from his pocket. Near Little House, we found Sergeant Major A. Voorhees Wyckoff, that's Albert, dangerously wounded, whom some of the men were carrying to the rear. We were in considerable danger on the open plain, but as soon as we reached the regiment, were somewhat more secure. Our men had instinctively begun scraping the earth together in front of them and making a ditch in which they might lie out of sight without waiting for orders. With the view of preventing their digging rifle pits, the enemy fired volley after volley as close as possible to our heads and making the dirt fly over us. We could only escape by clinging close to Mother Earth. Some implements were passed to the regiment, and they began entrenching with earnestness. Near midnight, during a lull, I started back at quick pace to reach the hospital before the firing could be renewed. I succeeded in getting out of range before they poured out another volley." The chaplain continues, "When I came again to our field hospital, I found there our young and gallant Sergeant Major Wyckoff, insensible with a bullet in his brain. There was the ambulance I had engaged for him. The first look in his face and upon the wound with the oozing brain told me that all our endeavors were useless and it would be soon over with him. So I told the lieutenant of the ambulance corps he might take some other man. Oh, how sad my heart was as I sat on the ground beside that young fellow and felt my helplessness to aid him. With my attendants, I knelt and offered prayer for the soul of our dying friend. Then, worn out with the excitement and the exertions of the day, I threw myself on the ground about 1 o'clock at night and rested for 2 hours. Then I examined the sergeant major. He was still breathing heavily. I went down to the pack train and woke Henry, our cook, and directed him to get breakfast and coffee for Colonel Campbell and the adjutant, and to take them out to them as soon as he possibly could. The pioneer started a good fire, and taking a blanket, I slept by it until one of our men woke me 2 hours afterwards and offered me coffee. I felt then much refreshed and went back to the hospital. The sergeant major, Wyckoff, had breathed his last. With Sergeant Klein in the drum corps, I had a grave dug in a clear part of the woods. The day was opening, and in an awful reveille of artillery ushered it in. Shells came crashing through the trees and somewhat disconcerted our work. It was again resumed and the grave completed. Summoning all our men, we carried the body to the grave. I cut some locks of hair from his head to send to friends, and a button or two from his vest as mementos. We wrapped the corpse in a shelter tent and then in a blanket, and lowering it down, covered it with cedar boughs. A few words of burial service were pronounced, and we filled the grave, putting up a marked headboard. Then, with sad hearts, we turned away from the resting place of a soldier who, in life, we loved, and in death, we honored. So that's Chaplain Haynes' recollection. Now, I want to turn to the adjutant, Edmund D. Halsey, for his memory. He says, quote, "Among the fallen of June 1st was Sergeant Major Voorhees Wyckoff, one of the very best men in the regiment. Of a frank, open countenance, always in good humor, undergoing every hardship without murmuring, and never shirking either danger or work, his death was an irreparable loss to the regiment. I believe he was a perfectly consistent Christian man, and I have been most intimate with him since we were at White Oak Church. He was a beautiful writer and caught at once the proper way of doing the work of the adjutant's office, relieving me from much of its drudgery." So there you have the story of Albert Voorhees Wyckoff, the sergeant major of the 15th New Jersey Infantry. As mentioned by the chaplain, Voorhees Wyckoff was buried around the battlefield. In fact, it was on the Cartwright farm. And later on, after the war, as the consolidation of battlefield graves were being grouped together into what became national cemeteries, Wyckoff's grave was moved, his body disinterred, and he now rests in the National Cemetery near Cold Harbor. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.